Welcome back, everybody, for this afternoon's session. Our second session on, our session on limiting the Anthropocene. And we have as you've gathered from previous sessions, we have a very tight timeline, so I'm not going to mess around with introductions other than to say that we have the immense pleasure of kicking off with Kevin Hamilton from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and Orit HALPERN from New School University on End Time, Apocalyptic Systems in Media Art and Design. I'm forcing their hand on timing for the presentation, so we'll try and really build back some question time, but we do have to apparently finish on the dot at 3. Okay, Kevin and Orit, are you ready?
Yeah, I guess so.
Typical
All right, we're just going to start with Trevor.
All right.
So we're actually recalling this talk, Inhabiting the Apocalypse. And it comes from a conversation between the two of us, between history and art, in times of thinking about how to encounter the contemporary imaginaries and discourses of the Anthropocene and technology in ethical ways.
Imagine as a takeoff point here the current growth of art that's out there to expose infrastructures, Trevor Paglen being one of the most well-known examples. Imagine this work in a lineage of 19th century naturalism, like Charles Lyell, that's trying to call into our eyesight unseen systems beneath our feet. One of our questions here is, are the rhetorics of revelation associated with this kind of work the right metaphors for talking about our lives with infrastructure? There's a long lineage of artists performing the role of visionaries and calling to light the world that's about to come upon us, the destructive world. And we'd like to cast some questions about whether the metaphor of revelation is the right one for art and design that deals with infrastructures.
More and more we live in a state previously known only to those closer to the point of infrastructural violence, the state of what geographer Bruce Brown is calling the catacomb, an existence within permanent crisis management without hope or promise of future redemption. To this end, life itself, for example, is being recruited for infrastructures. In the example here from the Rising Currents show at MoMA, where oysters are being recruited to kind of defend this now annihilated New York City. This poses this kind of situation where life itself is being recruited as infrastructure to facilitate the ongoing circulation of capital poses certain questions, particularly at a moment where the very landscape is being recruited and figure ground is disappearing before a new architecture of landscape, ecology, and technology. It also poses questions for what it means to live under regimes that do not envision human control over the world. They are in this sense not anthropocentric, but rather have put management in place of control and replaced progress with a language of resilience and precarity that make extinction itself a comfort, a lullaby with which to legitimate our contemporary modes of existence and practice and death. We speak of geological time, but capital has turned the story of geology into the mandate for the legitimacy for destruction. If paleontology provides a new other in the name of extinction, we now embrace this real as though locked in a lover's embrace. And this managerial compulsion, this desire to control, manifests itself in many locations. For example, here in Songdo, the largest real estate development on Earth, that is considered to be a prototype or test bed, a demo for the future of urban life. Its claim to fame, of course, is that it's a smart or ubiquitous city in Korean parlance, and it's part of a new global infrastructure of territories, free trade zones, it's a utopia, and logistical nodes for global infrastructure, as well as part of a global kind of infrastructure of these spatial products being rolled out and produced by high-tech companies and leveraged through finance capital ranging from India to Ecuador to Africa. And I've been working on these complexes for quite a while. What is so curious is how bandwidth, as in bits per second flowing over some fiber optic cable, and life have come to be equated. So this relationship between resilience and computation has now become one. A new discourse of resilience that seemingly mandates and embraces precarity as sort of capitalist absorption of geo-eco-technological events into a mandate for circulation. And Songdo is not alone. We live in a very smart world these days. From secure data centers to logistical systems to green cities to seed banks and ecological preserves. All these projects share in imagining the future in terms of catastrophic and devastating events. They inhabit the catacon, if you will, whether those of terror, informatic, or otherwise, economy or environment, and they respond to this imagery almost hopeful and optimistically through the ever-increased application of and intervention into life by technology and design. As our cities are destroyed by rising waters, and this is a video from the Rising Currents show from 2011 where MoMA and PS1 speculated on the future of New York. As our cities are destroyed by rising waters, we literally render these anticipated emergencies as beautiful and desirable, comforting even. We even embrace death. In fact, one might say we're speculating on the hope of massive forms of extinction and death, and indeed this has been said many times before. And here in this lulling, beautiful rendering of aqueous communities being flooded, we see kind of complacent, this is really wonderful, watch the helicopter. If there is a feature to this emerging landscape, it is that it's really calm, is that there is a sensorial element, a disappearance of figure-ground relations. Entire landscapes either brought into buildings or literally resculpted as massive-scale spatial products, here in the case of MVRDV's projection for Energy City, Korea, or perhaps in its existing market hall in Rotterdam. Maximum density spaces that literally bring environments into buildings through the infinite sweeps and marketing strategies and fly-throughs of kind of these demonstrations of this ecological space. And this is also true of the best of the marketing going on for places like Songdo. It's as though we've lost our senses, literally. We cannot see nor apprehend that which is before us because this world is infinitely malleable and scalable. And all these kind of these demo videos are very common, in architectural rendering, and certainly have become like the typical way of walking people through a site since digital rendering and animation became pervasive in the field in the 90s. This merging of interior and exterior, this question of perceptual confusion, bodily disorder, and catastrophe has happened before. In a sudden turn, leaving all these visions of capacity, we want to ask about another moment when catastrophe already happened, when we had to contemplate not the eternal management of the present, but the future, as in what world we would like to build. After all, this has happened before. It was one of the first markers of art coming out of the Second World War, that infrastructural violence, the violence beyond or outside the human individual body to apprehend, provoked a crisis of spatiality and sensation. For example, the opening scene of Hiroshima, Mon Amour, is it love for the bomb or for the other? Where literally human desire and love channels itself into the landscape of death and sensory apperception. Two bodies locked in love or death, are they melting bodies or loving ones, become the space of the hospital and then the memorial as we go through this clip. Body is landscape and architecture, a landscape that creates affect but is resolute in its insistence that we cannot see nor apprehend the infrastructure that has produced this space, mainly that of the bomb and its devastations that far exceed the time and space of human or even biological life. Hiroshima is sensory disorientation. The question Hiroshima Mon Amour faces is that of how to inhabit a world already destroyed and how to encounter difference, that of one's lover or of the devastation of life at times in scales beyond or outside human apprehension. In Hiroshima Mon Amour, the problem of perception and of landscape comes to the forefront. And in this talk, we'll discuss this question of witnessing technical death and the issues of the imaginaries that are thus developed by discussing a quick history of the rise of the landscape as an aesthetic, and then turning to what architecture Lebbeus Woods labels radical reconstruction.
So there's a question here about what's left to reveal at spaces of trauma. People are experiencing infrastructure deeply and violently, and also what's left to reveal when, in the name of utopia, infrastructure has been fully embraced in the kind of smart cities we've seen. We wanted to look a bit at how there's a loss of figure ground in both of those spaces, both in a dystopian and a utopian sense. And there's some histories here that are helpful to us in understanding how we got there. I'm going to go very quickly through a couple of these histories here. Is that one, we might look at taking some prompts from Hiroshima as a space of tragic engagement with an infrastructure that really changed the world, nuclear weapons. We could even look at the way the United States has had to try to manage visibility, manage figure ground, manage the visibility of infrastructures as part of the process of deterrence. as part of the process of affecting behavior in another state that one wants to affect without actually launching an attack. You can take some cues here from the fact that America had to debate for almost a year before even releasing images of the first thermonuclear detonation at Operation Ivy. And this starts to cue us into saying there's something at stake in the Cold War deterrent project of building infrastructures and building visibility. Two shout out examples and histories that would be well worth diving into with more time, and that we have a bit, would be the DEW Line project, probably more known to folks in Canada than in the United States. A project that required some deft attention to figure ground on two fronts. One is they needed radar to detect Soviet bombers coming over the pole. But two is they needed these new radar networks across the radar stations across the pole, across the Arctic Circle, not to be too visible so as to look like an occupation of Canada by America. So they had a quite complicated figure ground navigation to work with, and they solved it by these giant radar arrays hooked to networked computers, early cybernetic projects, a very small array of operators relatively, and most interestingly, a dome from Buckminster Fuller. Because one of the interesting meetings of the problems here of how to detect enemy bombers in a snowy environment where the snow might obstruct your radar is that you need to build something over that radar that will not show up on the radar. And Buckminster Fuller was the only one to help them with that. So some interesting lineages here that result in a highly, highly visible landscape intervention, right? Because in the end, the only thing you see about these things are the domes themselves. And so there's a figure here that looks alien, and so maybe not so much a threat as a space of settlement. A very clear reliance on figure ground, and it shows up in their film work. This is work I do on the history of Air Force filmmaking, and they produce film after film of these stations with these picturesque shots emphasizing the alien figure of these domes against the barren waste of a landscape, which of course we know was not a waste. The indigenous people certainly didn't experience this as a clearly delineated figure ground. This became a portal to new negotiations of sovereignty with Canada, and of course a source of toxicity for their landscapes. We can look at the whole history of American involvement to try to use deterrence as catacon, as a way of staving off World's End, as a space of wrestling to control figure ground and eventually giving way to mere management of a fused condition. Vietnam is a turning point for America for this, which is also a very computation and image heavy space. And just briefly, what I would point to here would be that much of what we were up to at that point was America was up to very small bombing runs, analyzed on a weekly basis in spaces like the White House to try to determine what small gestures from a long distance away might affect change. Defoliation, or sort of reduction of the ground to expose the figures, was the order of the day. A sort of exposure of figure and ground that people are experiencing as traumatic to this day. And in a really interesting note, one of the last efforts in Vietnam was Operation Igloo, which was an effort to turn the jungle into a cybernetic smart space by dropping these sensors into the jungle. The idea was that they could get around this endless cycle of target identification through flown photography, bombing, re-photography to document the effects, negotiation of the diplomatic effects, and then back again. It never went. The figure ground just collapsed. So they tried to make a smart jungle to try to address that problem, but it was also unsuccessful. Sorry, we're jumping quickly here. And so from the smart jungle to the smart city.
Smart jungle to the smart city. So coming out of this fully mediated, if confused landscape, returns us to the shining, gleaming global infrastructures of our present, these computational fortresses, these spaceships in the deserts. Smartness has become the language for negotiating time and space into the immediate present. It is also an aesthetic, affective space, as we recall, the space of managing our perceptions and sentiments along with our bodies. And this discourse is absolutely positive. As Moment PS1 stated in their catalog, and I quote, we've joined forces to address one of the most urgent challenges facing the nation's largest city, sea level rise resulting from global climate change. Through the national debate on infrastructure is currently focused on shovel-ready projects, They go on to say, thankfully, as in past two economic recessions, construction has slowed dramatically in New York, and much of the city's remarkable pool of architectural talent is available to focus on innovation. So awesome, yeah. So in the face of all this innovation on death, what's to be done? So for the last final 10 minutes, I'd like to just contemplate the work of another architect, an architect of destruction, basically Lebbeus Woods, who's very famous as a kind of theoretical and influence on many big architects in our present. And Lebbeus Woods also had things to say about landscape, and primarily he said that it would seem, and I'm quoting now, that the contemporary urban world with its aggregates of buildings that become in themselves artificial landscapes and contexts, entirely displacing the natural, the architect's role would seem to inevitably expand beyond designing built single objects. And he goes on to say that what we need to do is produce these hybrid landscapes, and that this might perhaps, and I quote, manifest a different attitude toward architecture, one that plays down a heroic conquest of nature and looks for modes of coexistence with it. As in all cases of coexistence, neither presence is sacrificed at the expense of the other, and rather a new balance can be created. And in these projections, and he is the architect, if we will, of catastrophe. He provided vistas of wars and of earthquakes, of different spaces where the earth or ourselves have been kind of shattered and rendered. He was one of the first to say, in his work on wars, he never differed between war, for example, or between a natural event. He said, an inspiration from one Japanese architect, and I quote, "Earthquakes are like wars," end quote. He then went on to say, and architecture is war as well. And it's a war because it is a battle to reassert the human over nature. To think otherwise than heroic architecture demands that we must assume no event is natural, would suggest an architecture that is a landscape, in his words, of heterarchy, grounded in quantum theory and cybernetics. For him, one of the most key things in creating all these disaster zones and these places after the catastrophe is that drawing is not a failure to build, he said. It is a diagram of thought. He wrote of drawing that it's not against practice. His sketches are about the future tense of practice, but about what it means not to rebuild or return, but to radically reconstruct a landscape. And he stood on this idea that we can't think of rebuilding, we must think of reconstruction. And I quote, "Drawing is the tool of the architect on the move, on the run, who is first of all a citizen of the stricken city, and the new dynamic stability." End quote. The enactment of a possibility for the world to be remade by the architect who is unstable, unclear of their perspective, within or with, to use my colleague Jamie Allen's words, with the world, and being unable to command it. Here, landscape becomes the tool to reconfigure the hubris of technology conquering nature, and rather opens this body of the city or the person to time, and to the fact that these wounds are connections between all of us on Earth. It is a connection because in words within the destruction of war, environment, in his words, one injects, and he has these kind of penetrating vectors through the building, our desires, our dreams of architecture. This injection, this demonstration of the wounds, what he labels scabs of trauma, renders spaces open, vectors to other times, to recall history, reconstruct it, not an attempt to resurrect some mythic past. In his work particularly on Sarajevo, which also followed on his work on a number of other projects concerning time, space, and science fiction, he continued to insist on this idea of a free space, of vectors of flight, of possible connections that go everywhere. In his work on Sarajevo, he opened with two quotes, and I'll go them now. "Every age has its own face. The face of ours is a savage one. Delicate spirits cannot confront it. They swerve their eyes in terror. They invoke the ancient prototypes." He then goes on to quote another individual saying, "Sarajevo is the first city of the 21st century. The message we send back to you is not a happy one, but we are still alive." In Sarajevo, Woods argues one recognizes the loss of figure-ground relations, of losing identities, of the inability to plan because of the constant shifts of terror. And in facing the destruction of the city and its constant impermanence, the architect, he argues, must respond with new institutions, a new parliament, as one shown here, made of what he called free spaces woven through the surviving, in his words, Cartesian framework. But I also want to talk of intimacies. At the same moment as he was working on Sarajevo and visiting Zagreb, facing the regular warfare on the ground there, he was also writing letters in his journal. And there's a moment in his diary that perhaps best evokes this effort to think the unthought, to think the world that is to come after its devastation, to encounter the terrible, this terror reality that is the fate of most of us on Earth. An effort that returns us to the landscapes of Hiroshima, Mon Amour. In a series of letters imagined to his lover, perhaps his final partner, Alexandra Wagner, perhaps another woman, I can't exactly tell, and no one seems to know. He opens, and I recall a summer, and I quote, "We had no names," end quote. He implies no identities, no stable bodies or conscious states. He writes about state changes, and seeing his lover sleeping but thinking she was awake, and kissing her accidentally, waking her up, bringing her to consciousness. And he writes these recollections, or maybe fictions, near drawings that you see here, of topographies of mountains and landscapes that depict a nowhere, but at once familiar mountains that could be cities or perhaps bodies. He writes to this woman, maybe real, maybe one in a dream. "Finally, time, space compressed between us. Where are you?" By compression, he continues, I do not mean they become less, end quote. Not less as in the sense of MV-DRV. Rather, he wrote, they become more intense, more piercing of my soul. We grow physically closer, yet every hour apart is a continent, each day a world, end quote. Perhaps these continents and worlds evoked in his drawings are new forms of connection, non-entropic potentials compressed afar, never static or fully locatable. And then he continues, and I quote, by world, I do not refer to geography unless it is a mapping of pain. Rather, I imagine now a matrix of fierce energy, the memories, and his words are blacked out, this failure of expression that opens perhaps to the desire to draw and still connect to this other body, each burning, completing itself as though each point were incandescent, enough for an existence itself, enough to propel new forms of life. There's a drawing on the side that you see here of these images as though necessary flights beyond the page, perhaps to compensate for what cannot be written, or perhaps as a dialogue in search of connection between words and images, between territories, between the bodies of lovers, between energies. It is done in a hotel room in London. It envisions a fragmented world, perhaps one where time and space are rethought. He draws this to produce this diagram of potentials, and he continues, and I quote, by enough, I do not imagine the desire can ever be satisfied. Where are you? End quote. Another drawing accompanies this statement, a turbulent geography, one with new vectors, always seeking others that we cannot consume or locate, creating unfulfilled desires, a world without set bodies or names or identities or territories, one full of pain, but always invoking the desire to live and to encounter others, animals, beings, humans, who will produce energy for the world to come, energy to find love. With efforts to find his lover, who has no name, to encounter this geography, returns us to the initial question of architecture, love, time, and pain. So we return to Hiroshima, Mon Amour, in the final section. At the end of, Rava's character, who has no name, says in the beginning of the movie, and I quote, why deny the necessity of remembering, end quote, while tourists look at the Peace Monument. It doesn't seem to matter that history is there. She continues, listen to me. I know something else. It will begin all over again. 200,000 dead, 80,000 wounded in 9 seconds. These figures are official. It will begin all over again. It will be 10,000 degrees on Earth, 10,000 suns, they will say. The asphalt will burn, chaos will prevail, a whole city will be raised from the earth and fall back into ashes, end quote. But of course, the entire purpose of her repeating this fact is that it will not happen again. Here we're forced to contend with the desire one age bequeathed upon us, the ambition not yet realized, for a future out of our calculative fantasies of control, an impulse that has now turned inward into an endless obsession with the interface. We do not yet know the systems we are in. We should not confuse technology with futurity, and we should recognize the internal instabilities, frictions, and possibilities of our networks, our machines, ourselves.
Thank you.
That was very fast.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we're gonna do a very quick handover to Roberta, but while we do that, perhaps if there are immediate questions for Orit and Kevin, is there anybody who's wanting to raise something at this point? Go ahead, Roberta, if you want to go and sit up. I've got a question if nobody else has. I'm just wondering in this, I mean, those images are stunning and the texts are very moving, and I'm wondering how in this technological envisioning of our planet you think about at all if things like satellite imaging of the Earth from NASA, because it's so often depicted as the kind of tyrannical militaristic force, but at the same time, in terms of climate change, obviously, there are images of our planet from afar that are somehow a really interesting counterweight to some of the images that you showed us of drowning spaces.
Well, one of the things, well, when this was a 30-minute presentation, 35-minute presentation.
That was a compression algorithm.
That was super compressed to the point of like, I don't know what we were doing. But anyway, we actually did talk about we actually did talk about the fact that there's always this like weak messianic possibility, you know, things can get inverted or reused. And Woods actually is pretty big on that. He is not nostalgic. I mean, that's fundamentally like the move for him in terms of architecture is you're not about going back to like before there was these evil things, and it's not about not living with them. It is exactly about the fact that you have to live, like you have to figure out how to act ethically or politically, even if that satellite came from a military history. Like that's the mandate. For him, it was about really attempting to think those spaces and those representations as far more malleable. So he had a project that he took out of here, or didn't talk about walls, for example, where he takes up all these barriers, like the Mexican-American, the Israeli barrier wall, you know, and the thing is for him is like, what if you invert it and like these things become not static but mobile? They're the very sites where we see societies attempting to negotiate, you know, their boundary lines, and how do you open them to permeability. So he had all these kind of thought things about trying to use the world that is. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, sort of. It was a lousy question anyway, I'm sorry. But yeah, thank you. If we can move over to Roberta, and we'll come back for discussion generally afterwards, that'd be great. Thanks very much, you two. Okay, so Roberta BUIANI from Lakehead University is going to talk about instrumental anthropocentrism, insect sustainable culture, and technological innovation.
You made a strange face.
I have a strange face.
Okay, so I don't know which is the... Yes! No. Did I do it correctly? Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so... So no to the very childish Prezi presentation. Yes, I was asked to provide a PowerPoint presentation, and I decided to do something completely different. And so here is my, oh, is it? Okay. So this is my Prezi presentation. I thought, well, why not making it more? Okay. More childish. Okay. So I would like to start with this quotation. In this paper, I would like to add a specification to the term anthropocentrism. In the cases that I will show, anthropocentrism is instrumental. It's not just an inherent position. So we're talking about anthropocentrism in spite of itself, in spite of what we would like to do. While this contradiction can easily theorize, it is only thanks to the direct involvement with the practice explored that I was able to find its evidence. This paper is an excerpt from a much longer paper which got published early on in the journal Technoscienza, in English, of course. And so if you want to read it, like I can give you the references. For the time, because of the time constraint, I'm going to just concentrate on 2 examples. So I'm going to leave out all the part about the most technoscientific side of things, and I'm going to just concentrate on the part that I actually experienced through my research creation project. So between 2013 and 2015, I conducted an experiment in insect breeding. I was interested in the emerging hype regarding entomophagy. So for those who don't know it, is the eating of insects. The Food and Agricultural Organization, also known as FAO, had issued a report in 2013 documenting the detrimental consequences of logging and excessive cattle breeding. And I quote, "Land is scarce, and expanding the area devoted to farming is rarely a viable and sustainable option. Oceans are overfished, and climate change and related water shortages could have profound implications for food production. To meet the food and nutrition challenges of today and tomorrow, we need to reevaluate what we eat and how we produce it." So basically, here, insect can actually become one of those options that we have. And this was just an hypothesis that was thrown in. But, and this was not what initially prompted my reflections. What prompted my reflections and skepticism was not the report, but the increasing appearance of a series of products, which you see here, which claimed they claimed to encourage to embracing entomophagy by concealing insects in quite exquisitely packaged treats, or by promoting the acquisition of household bioreactors, all dressed up in sleek-looking and ingenious design, promising to be clean, no spill, which is a necessary quality because you don't want to touch insects while you're breeding them, and easy to operate for convenience. And the word convenience being repeated over and over again reminds me of the convenience technologies that we are using on a daily basis. So these devices claimed to be complementary to or improve the customer's lifestyle, and yet did nothing to change it. In addition to maybe accepting this food as a novelty, the customer's everyday consumerist habits and individualist behavior stayed the same. So, in order to verify the sustainability claim that this insect industry, which is what I came to call, claim to do, I acquired a colony of mealworms. You see the various stages down there, from eggs to larva, to pupa, to full-grown adulthood. And I decided to make my own bioreactor and started actually making food with them. And actually, well, the first thing that needs to be said is human beings only eat the larvae, so only one stage. The rest of it either goes in the garbage or gets fed to animals if you have them. So the nutritional and conventional potentials of mealworms is actually manifest and quite demonstrated. Mealworms feed off kitchen compostable waste, and their waste can be used as fertilizer. But they reproduce too fast. So there are some questions that are raised. How do we dispose of the excess without the presence of a community of like-minded individuals who would support, sustain, and especially share this source of food? Treating this source of food as an individual choice makes no sense in this case. Moreover, my initial disgust for the creepy, crawling creatures populating my bioreactor, I couldn't even touch them at the beginning, gradually turned into a strange form of affection. I could actually touch them, caress them, but not kiss them. But, however, stricken by a serious problem of overcrowding, I had no other choice but to practice unnatural selection, or natural selection by any other means. I was in charge of selecting who would survive and who would not. So how do the rhetorics of sustainability behind entomophagy and its byproducts coexist with human exceptionalism? Because we are talking about human exceptionalism here. Human exceptionalism was clashing against the promises of sustainability and ecological recovery and renewal advertised by those advocating this practice. How does sustainability coexist with the mechanisms of value and production and consumptions that seem to emerge from these products? Now, this is not limited to entomophagy. As I said, I will only concentrate on these examples, but there is a whole industry involving revolving around the inadvertent or purpose exploitation of insects. And I'm putting exploitations between brackets because it's not really exploitation, because we all think that we are not exploiting them. We think that we are actually using them to save the world. This industry uses the dual attraction and repulsion to insects and the notion of sustainability to draw attention not to the need for change, or to the need to change our consumerist and technophile habits, but to new forms of technological and entrepreneurial undertakings. I call these undertakings the insect industry. So today's technological paradigms and the economic obligations of late capitalism play a substantial role in shaping and clashing with the sustainable content that these new practices claim to support. I am not here, just to be clear, I'm not challenging or diminishing their often well-meant commitment to ethics of conservation and waste reduction. However, these commitments and ethics are undermined by the very necessity to support practices dedicated to consumerism and accumulation. The rhetoric that propels the insect industry agrees with recent post-human concerns regarding the role and the value of the non-human other, prompting a call and an urgency to act quickly to preserve the world as we know it. And I underline the world as we know it, because its doing tells another story. In fact, these post-human concerns are generally contradicted by the prioritization of human needs at the expenses of ecological balance, thanks to an ambiguous interpretation of the very word sustainable. So sustainable and sustainability are two words that are attached, on the one hand, to ecology and conservation, and on the other hand, growth and innovation. How do you reconcile the two? In the case of the insect industry, the two coexist, or they want to coexist. The idea of preservation and the call to responsibility in insect fabrication, breeding, and modification is principally opportunistic, preoccupied to various degrees, and expressed in more or less blunt terms to reach the good, not of the world, but of human species, rather than to attain a balance for the entire ecosystem. As well, sustainability here legitimizes growth and surplus production, as well as maximization of financial gains. So in fact, innovation is attached to technology and design as the only options that can materially and tangibly stand for growth. They intrigue and fascinate potential consumers and are to be preferred to old-fashioned low-tech solutions. We saw a little bit of this at the beginning of the presentation of Orit and Kevin, this idea that, oh yeah, the world is gonna end, oh, let's make some beautiful design. Let's try to further on our system. So customers are really easily lured to buy into the classic technological trap that technologies will fix the world. So this is a case of solutionism. Basically, the customers are willing to forgive that these new products may be new, but do perpetuate the same economic imperatives that we've always been using. The idea that capitalism grows through investment and innovation in commodity and production, and it grows by necessary expansion of producer-consumers. So again, I'm not accusing the insect industry of greenwashing or eco-branding. But I think this is like the insect industry is actually caught into this need to actually further this system, because it is through this system that it is able to survive, and because part of the system is to produce this type of designs and these types of products that I just show you. Okay, so these are the two things I forgot. Sorry. So two industries. One is industry in food design, and the other one is industrial design. So food design, so the packaging of insects for human consumption, such as I was looking into it after 6 months that I had written my paper, and it had disappeared. And this is normal because it's part of like a bunch of startups that are coming and going. And they cleverly design packages. I think that those packages are exquisite. They're incredibly beautiful. They're really cleverly designed in order to conceal their main ingredient, that is the insect, in order to bypass the sense of disgust that often deters the potential customers from trying entomophagy, thus turning the food into a novelty. On the website of Ento, we read, quote, "We do this because we love great food, designing exciting new experiences and, well, the world we live in." So saving the world is the last. The project of sustainability becomes secondary then to food experience pleasure and enjoyment, as the customer is motivated by the consumerist design to try a new product rather than by awareness and by a wish to make a real contribution to the environment and to sustainability. The project that I showed you at the beginning, so I'm going to show it again, like the bioreactors that I tried to emulate, employ industrial design to introduce entomophagy. Perfect, I'm almost done. Also in this case, environmental data about the ecological impact in the form of that report that I showed you before, that I told you about before from the Food and Agricultural Organization. So they are using this data about the ecological impact of meat production, which are accompanied by promotion strategies to try insect bioreactors as innovative kitchen appliances. So say like a yogurt incubator or bread maker. So having such a vessel at home then would guarantee the owner autonomy, as he or she would be able to enjoy a continuous source of protein-rich food while effortlessly contributing to sustainable culture. The tendency is to focus on the product and on the contribution of the single individual rather than the community, on design rather than on the food itself, on the ownership of the object bioreactor, so the object itself over the potential value of the insects. And the insects are being left in the background, only portrayed as the content of the bioreactor rather than the main subject of interest. And actually a curiosity, because everybody is disgusted but very, very interested in them. So to conclude, the applications merging insects and technology, or insects and design, in this case industrial design, voices a necessity to acknowledge the coexistence of insects as animal other technologies and the human. However, the very focus on individual choice and on lifestyle demonstrates how their mandate and goals not only confirms a prevalence of anthropocentric objectives, but they also, for necessity, and sometimes for choice, but mostly for necessity, a trust in the technology and the innovative product over the insect that has inspired it. Although the practices I mentioned are apparently unrelated, and of course, there's many more other practices, but like they all, like mainly, like you see them and you cannot find a relation between them. But they engage, all of them, with distinct fields of research and creative entrepreneurship, with their emphasis always being on innovation and sustainability. And on top of it, they all follow the same scientific information, the same discursive patterns and rhetorical strategies. They obey and at the same time contradict the imperatives of economic growth and the principles of technological innovation supported by Western culture. This tendency reveals a solutionist approach in its enthusiastic reliance in technology, science, and design. However, it also shows how considering alternative paths that go against this trust in technologies would be damaging to these designers and scientists' financial survival. So are we not having design? Ultimately, this confirms that the insect industry is a product of human exceptionalism. Behind its noble commitment to sustainability, it uses insects as a way to draw attention to and magnify the reactions of awe and enthusiasm regarding emerging technologies and scientific innovations. Thus, effectively mitigating or even silencing any concern or unwelcome criticism these technologies raise. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Roberta. While we do a transition, does somebody have a question while Simon sets up? Yes. Can you grab the mic, please, so we can all hear you?
Thanks. That was really interesting. I'm just curious about whether or not you looked at whether anyone is looking at more traditional practices of larva eating. I'm thinking specifically about the silk industry and how pupa are consumed by the silk industry.
Yes, I did. Actually, I was looking at animal insect husbandry, which is what this industry is about. And I also looked at some attempts to industrially reproduce those. It's part of an ongoing project. I'm trying to put all of these together because actually the silk industry is kind of a little bit different. But yeah, it's part of an industry that has been going on for like thousands of years, but in the same way as the entomophagy. So now we are coming out with this, and this is totally the project of Western culture that says, oh, okay, so there's a problem, let's try to solve it. Let's try to solve it not by going back to traditions, but by using new technologies, because this is the only way that we can actually solve things. And actually, it's the only way we can get money from it.
Okay, great. And thanks, Roberta, also for pointing to the connection between your reflections and Orit's and Kevin's. This question of just using an aestheticization of a technological solution that's actually doing nothing to address the real issue. I think these are really valuable things that we can come back to. Okay, Simon Penny from University of California, Irvine, is going to regale us with cultural software, materiality and abstraction in 60s art and technology.
Yeah, hi everybody. I feel like I'm in the wrong place because I'm actually going to give a paper on media art history. So if that's not what you came for. So, in the 1960s was a veritable cultural Precambrian explosion which resulted in a diversity of forms and approaches, as we know. The conventional notion of the plastic arts as defined by material genres, painting and sculpture, etc., was being entirely dismantled, giving rise to a primeval soup of new forms which burst out of the normal institutions, happenings, mail art, body art, performance, installation, site-specific, environmental, and conceptual art. The new practices were often referred to collectively as post-object art, a term redolent of Jack Burnham's Unobject and identified in Lucy Lippard's well-known book, 6 Years, The Dematerialization of the Art Object from 1966 to 1972. The term post-object was applied because a key quality of the new practices seemed to be a rejection of conventional genres that were preoccupied with art objects, objet d'art. This had at least 3 dimensions: artworks that were transient or placed no value in permanence, a concern with temporal and artisanal process as opposed to product, and the notion of a non-material art form. Hence, to speak of a general class of post-object art only obscures a deeper and profound binary arising in 60s and 70s art. On the one hand, we have artwork which is embodied, lived, materially instantiated, socially and environmentally situated. On the other hand, we have artworks which eschew materiality entirely. Body art, site-specific art, related practices were materially and geopolitically situated as political and activist practices engaged with community issues. But at the same time, much conceptual art sought a dematerialized and Neoplatonic condition of pure immaterial information, artwork finally rid of the inconveniences of its res extensa. The notion that the essence of the artwork was an immaterial idea and that artwork could exist as a written specification and need never be realised was proclaimed with varying inflection by numerous conceptual artists. Such pronouncements have been historically acknowledged by conceptualists such as Sol LeWitt, Lawrence Weiner, Douglas Hubler, and Robert Barry. Barry's inert gas series consisted of photographic evidence of the release of a quantity of an invisible gas. That is, they gave evidence of nothing of the sort, an ironic commentary on documentation and the truth value of photography, and centrally on the redundancy of realisation. We know that cybernetics was influential in art circles, as is indicated by Nam June Paik's Manifesto for Cybernated Art of 1964, as garbled as it is brief. No matter, it was not only artists who made garbled statements about computing in the 1960s. Internationally, a slew of late 60s exhibitions, such as Cybernetic Serendipity, Software, Information, and Experiments in Art and Technology, celebrated cybernetics. In the Experiments in Art and Technology projects, Bell Labs engineer Billy Kluver paired leading artists such as Rauschenberg, Johns, and Tudor with Bell Labs engineers to make collaborative artworks, many of them interactive. Kluver was a colleague of Claude Shannon and part of the larger East Coast cybernetic circle. In Europe, United States and elsewhere, Gordon Pask, Nicholas Schofer, John Tangley, Edward Antovich, and others made cybernetically informed and behaving electronic and electromechanical artworks. A major vector by which cybernetic and systems theoretic ideas influenced the art world was Jack Burnham, who dedicated a full third of his tome Beyond Modern Sculpture, The Effects of Science and Technology on the Sculpture of this Century, 1968, to cybernetics, and not long after he published his essay Systems Aesthetics in Art Forum. He asserts in that essay, the specific function of modern didactic art has been to show that art does not reside in material entities, but in relations between people and between people and the components of their environment. Here we have a clear enunciation of an art concerned with process and system, as well as a prescient reference to what we now call relationality. In Burnham's essay, we find passages such as the following, which sound like they would be more at home in a journal of cybernetically informed ethology or sociology. He says, art, as an adaptive mechanism, is reinforcement of the ability to be aware of the disparity between behavioural pattern and the demands consequent upon the interaction with the environment. Art is a rehearsal for those real situations in which it is vital for our survival to endure cognitive tension, to refuse the comforts of validation by effective congruence when such validation is inappropriate because two vital interests are at stake. End of quote. A concern with processes occurring in systems was a fundamental aspect of systems theory, operations research, and cybernetics. This focus on systems can be seen as an aspect of an ontological shift, which, as mentioned above, rendered some cybernetics research quite strange, in Andy Pickering's words, according to conventional scientific subject-object binaries. The destabilisation of this subject-object binary is philosophically developed in the second-order cybernetics of von Förster and finds echoes in the autopoietic biology of Umberto Maturana. A similar concern with process arises in the art world, in the explicitly named process art, in systems aesthetics, and in various forms across the breadth of 1960s avant-garde practices. Such concerns have resonance, as it were, in music, literature, dance of the time, in the generative and chance operations of artists like Brian Gysin, John Cage, and Merce Cunningham. Now, while Hans Harker's works such as Condensation Cube and his real-time social system seem radically different from the point of view of media, from a systems point of view, they're consistent in the sense that their focus is systems. As noted, the notion of system was key to cybernetics discourse, and this preoccupation was evident across different kinds of practices, from Robert Morris's Box with the Sound of Its Own Making, to the walks of Richard Long, to the early video installations of Bruce Nauman, such as Video Surveillance Piece, Public Room, Private Room. Now, while the philosophical grounding of these works may be located in the work of Whitehead or Bergson, no doubt the ubiquitous discourse of cybernetics was immediately influential. Now, there's far more to say about the tensions between materiality and concept in art of the 1960s and 70s, and much of it has already been said. My goal here is to point to a larger and more curious trend in the history of ideas. Within the diversity of 1960s art, one can detect competing orientations towards Cartesian Platonism on the one hand, and a drive to situated, materialized, and embodied holism on the other. Sometimes, confusingly, these contradictory drives are found in individual works and often in the oeuvres of particular artists. Materiality and abstraction are not always in opposition, as was the case with minimal sculpture, Carl Andre's tile works being a case in point. In 1967, Donald Judd proclaimed, "Everything sculpture has, my work doesn't." On the contrary, Judd's work is sculpture, at least as we have come to understand it. The materiality abstraction dialectic of the 1960s in the arts was paralleled by a similar dialectic in the sciences of information. It was the moment of differentiation between cybernetics and computationalism. And the divisions in the art world, both theoretically and historically, map directly onto this division between the cybernetics and the artificial intelligence worldviews. The historical and theoretical association between, on the one hand, situated, materialized, and embodied works with cybernetics, and the more dematerialized conceptual work with artificial intelligence is highly suggestive. Put plainly, the historical transition from the situatedness of cybernetic theory to the Platonism of digital computing and artificial intelligence is directly paralleled in the emergence of conceptual art. Historically, conceptualism can be understood as an endpoint of the reductivism of 20th century avant-gardism. It strips away representationalism in the pictorial sense, affect, technique, and materiality. Conceptualism is simultaneous with the rise of AI cognitivist paradigm as the metaphysical epitome and theoretical grail of digital computing and the emerging discipline of computer science. It thus arises precisely when the notion of software as dematerialized information is formalized and gains a wider public exposure. It is also at this time that in computer science, the Cartesian dualism is reified so profoundly in the hardware-software dual as to more or less prevent any way of thinking around it. And that's the aspect of this paper that I think is most relevant to talking about digital arts. While these parallels are clear, we must be vigilant in avoiding readings which are historically inaccurate. It's instructive to review what the artists in Jack Burnham's exhibition Software thought they meant by the term software. We find the notion of software is very hazy as compared to our contemporary understanding of the commodified information object. Indeed, it is information. Likewise, computers themselves have been transmogrified. The digital appliance in your pocket is unrecognizable as a computer in the sense of the word was understood in the 1960s. So the rise of quantitative mathematical methods in the late 19th century and the demonstrable power of these techniques led to a widespread shift in scientific ontology, away from analogic and materially instantiated model building towards numerical and symbolic proof. We see this ascent with the mathematization of engineering and the sciences in the late 19th century. This trend accelerates after World War II with the rise of digital computing and automated algorithmic reasoning. It may be a historical accident, but concurrent with this, we see the rise of semiotics, post-structuralism, and the linguistic turn in critical theory, the rise of cognitivism in psychology, and similar effects in other areas of the social sciences, and conceptualism in the art world. All these are preoccupied with the representational systems. Across sciences, humanities, and the arts, the second half of the 20th century seems to have been under the sway of a neo-Cartesian zeitgeist. The question begs, what was happening that can account for this resurrection, as it were, of neo-Cartesianism? I argue that it was largely driven by the infiltration of computing into increasingly diverse fields and the commodification of a concept of software as dematerialized information which went along with it, and more generally the development of digital computing as our paradigmatic technology, and that term was coined by J. Bolter many years ago in his forgotten book Turing's Man. The emergence of consumer-grade computational technology carried dualistic axioms out of computer science into diverse aspects of culture previously somewhat insulated from such conceptions. And elsewhere I've referred to this as a kind of Trojan horse in computing culture. From this perspective, we can identify conceptual art as cultural software, in the sense that it pursues a rhetorical commitment to the idea of disembodied information. Conceptual artwork often consisted of notations made in some abstract symbolic system that specify an output if and when the machine is set in motion. Sol LeWitt famously asserted, "The idea becomes the machine that makes the art," in 1965. This sounds very like the specification for a computational machine. Lawrence Weiner asserted, "The piece need not be built." That implies that the artwork is complete in its symbolic specification sans materiality. Conceptual artworks are thus art algorithms. This trend towards ephemeralization began in the visual arts long before computers were readily available. Was this a case of artists as cultural early warning systems, in McLuhan's terms, catching a whiff of computer culture on the wind, as it were? Ezra Pound likewise asserts that artists are the antennae of the race. We can see conceptual art, or information art, as it was sometimes called, as a working out of the cultural, theoretical, and aesthetic implications of pure information and information technology without tangling with the hardware. Inasmuch as we regard digital art as part of the tradition of the plastic arts, and some do not, it is predicated on the revolution in practices of the 60s, on the Fluxus movement and the tradition of the art and technology movement. They provided its theoretical and methodological basis. The tradition of video and multimedia technical experimentation, typified by the Vazulkas, Dan Sandine, and others, created the professional identity and the context for the artist-technologist that we now all occupy. Without this, the explosion of electronic and digital media experimentation over the 70s, 80s, and 90s could simply not have existed. Dick Higgins' Fluxus conception of intermedia is a prerequisite for the interdisciplinarity demanded of digital media artists. Fundamental concepts of today's digital media and social media were prototyped in the art world. Think famously of Kit Galloway and Sherry Levine's extraordinary Hole in Space, predating video call apps such as Skype by nearly half a century. And I should add, constantly predating the recognition of these forms by commercial and academic research laboratories. Indeed, interactivity itself was an art world invention. Artists were making interactive artworks in the 1960s, such as Juan Downey's Against Shadows of 1968, Gordon Pask's Colloquy of Mobiles of 1968, and much of the experiments in art and technology. Pioneers were at work even in the 50s and even the 1940s, Nicholas Schofer's famous CISP series, and the progenitor of all interactive art, Gordon Pask's Musicolor. Conceptualism, idea art, and information art laid the groundwork for software art, but the situated and embodied aspects of the 60s revolution continues to challenge the underlying commitment in computing to the dissociability of matter and information. The conflict between the commitment to the specificities of material instantiation in the arts and the yearning for abstract Platonic truths in computing underlies the turmoil of the first decades of digital art, typified in the struggles with the concept of virtuality, within which a large part of first-generation digital art was framed. In retrospect, much of this concern with dematerialization was in fact a concern with rematerialization, or the recuperation of embodiment through innovative interface and system design. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. So we'll move into general discussion, but as Orit and Kevin come back to the table, any questions, immediate questions for Simon? Chris?
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, immediate question. It's interesting you talk about in the conceptual or visual arts, this kind of dematerialization move, because
Orit?
I'll just wait to Orit and Kevin. I know it's like playing, a round table. Musical chairs, yeah. We'll have some music going too.
This is a programming problem. Sorry, Chris.
Everyone you can sit in the middle, two of you.
Good thing I ended early.
So what I was just thinking is that, interestingly enough, this interesting tension you bring out about a kind of dematerialized Cartesian move associated with information and conceptual art. But what do you make of the arguments of people like Lucinda Childs or Simon Forti or Tricia Brown, also involved, in the EAT, in 9 Evenings? I mean, Tricia Brown also said she was working on machines for dance making, which are algorithms, essentially, the accumulation projects. Lucinda Childs, the same thing. And in fact, they all said, because they were coming out of what Michael Kirby called postmodern dance at the time, late 60s, early 1970s, they were all against the kind of Gesamtkunstwerk in performance. They wanted to use science and the kind of objective rigor of systems and rules and things like that to further a kind of objective notion of the body that was not adorned by a kind of machines. And yet that's why they started to work with these engineers, because they're actually interested in this link. So it paints an interesting tension, because in the one hand, they're talking about these machines for dance making and these rules and the algorithmic systems of information, and yet they're dealing with the body, which is already grounded, situated, and in time and space. So I'm curious, like, that link seems to be missing.
Well, I'm not sure that it's missing, but it does indicate the complexity, the sort of philosophical complexity of the period. And, when you ask those people in the experiments in art and technology movement, what it was they thought they were doing at the time, you get a response which is largely in cybernetic language. Because the cognitivist, internalist AI paradigm has not really been clearly enunciated at that point. So although they were talking about rule systems, they were talking more in terms of, I believe, situated environmental feedback loops, which could be articulated as procedures. Right? So definitely, I mean, it's a fascinating kind of mix of ideas at the time, but I don't think that any of that work clearly conceptualized the kind of internalist, the physical symbol system hypothesis of Simon and Newell.
Just a little question here. Oh. Hi. You're talking a lot about dematerialization, and for me, I come to the concept of what does material actually means, and when we fall into the concept of dematerialization, if it's materialized something that is stimulating our senses, then anything that stimulates our senses becomes material, matter, something that is actually stimulated. So in terms of having an object that is actually stimulating something in terms of my sight, my smell, my sense of touch, then it has become another realm of materialism. So when I see a software, a hardware, is translating a new language of the concept of materialism. So I just wonder, we are now in this technological, digital area, transforming those concepts so we integrate the concept self of material and not dematerializing, because dematerializing is like, for me, is like nothing, but there is something there. So I just wanted to hear your, in terms of what you think about that.
Well, you know, I begin this critique with the assumption that artists are commonly concerned with immediate sensorial experience and the construction of immediate sensorial experience. So when confronted with the rhetoric of immaterial information, of virtual reality and all the infoverse and all these other concepts of the kind of emerging computer culture of the 90s, this was a really profound breakdown, right? And at the time, there was the coin of the realm, as it were, was the notion of virtuality, that somehow this kind of perfect Platonic universe of free movement and the lack of any kind of restrictive physics, it was a kind of techno-utopianism, which artists and other sorts of cultural practitioners were drawn into this debate, and the terms of the debate were set. But in retrospect, I see the work of many artists of the period as attempting to make the qualities of the digital immediately sensorial in a way that could be experienced in a bodily way. That's what I think was the kind of philosophical crisis which was underlying was an extraordinary collision of what had been quite opposed cultural forces in a way. You know, computing dedicated to a mathematical symbolic representation, the performativity and direct experientiality of art, you know, just collided at that point. It was a mess. I think that's all I have to say about that.
I'll abuse my chair's prerogative because I'd like to see somehow try and create a very clumsy link, no doubt, between Roberta and Orit and Kevin, which you suggested, which is this question of design and a kind of aestheticization of a problem rather than a hyper design, an overlaid design, rather than addressing the real issue. So it's a kind of a maquillage, if you like. And I'm wondering if there is some, can I prompt you to pick up on that, Roberta, because I thought that your reflection on their paper was excellent, and I'd like to hear you three, sorry, respond to each other.
Well, I mean, I guess it's a theme on the three papers in many ways, in my opinion, which is, you know, I think we can always demonstrate the co-production of design and artistic practices with different epistemologies of technology and with technologies themselves. But one of the things, you can't hear me? But one of the things that's interesting, right, and keeps coming into this kind of Rancierian question of this politics of the organization of sense and how it's getting located. And so, like, what, you know, in some sense, what difference does a different, you know, what are the stakes of everything's material, but what are the stakes of how our perception is being organized in terms of how we relate to it? In that sense, I saw a lot around these two projects around the question of design's also place around care, or the ability to, you know, there's this question, right, of these actual insects that are being consumed, right? I mean, and this isn't, and in some sense I would push Roberta to talk to me in general about industrial agriculture, like, is that not what, like, food systems do, is kind of conceal their production through all sorts of, Whole Foods is a really design thing and whatever. So, I mean, for me, I'm kind of interested in that question, and then asking actually quite specifically in a situated historical way, like, what are the strategies, and how is design acting differently in this moment? So I guess for me, I was really fascinated looking at these insects, these little, not just the packaging. I mean, I actually wanted to hear more about the packaging. I actually wanted to, I was thinking like sushi boxes, and I had kind of things flipping through my head, but I would love to hear more about the aesthetic conventions by which they're trying to turn this into a chocolate bar or whatever. I thought chocolates too. They had, how they have those really fancy chocolate packaging these days? Yeah, okay. But I mean, I think that's sort of the level for me of like political and ethical concern, and also the place where like, if we're talking about design practice or reorganizing it, like your original question, that's where the interventions happen, is around asking around the aesthetic conventions that are being deployed, the temporality, the way time and space is being managed. So I was really curious actually about like this feature of this insect reproducing too fast, like the fact that there's all these like regulatory features of having to modulate the lives of these animals or not experienced, but at this way that's also forestalled, like that's the one thing that the consumer is not entitled to, whatever. I don't know, that's my observation.
Works. There, it works. Yes. Yeah. Maybe if I sit down for like 24 hours, I can answer. No, I mean, one of the things I'm really fascinating about is like this centrality, like the way in which design has become very much central lately. Like we've seen it also in other presentations today. The fact that like this, and I think Simon, I think your presentation somehow ties into our like very like it is. It comes into like this the idea, and also like the question that has been made before, like the question on materialization, rematerialization, the fact that we have all these new. This morning we were talking about new aesthetics. We were talking about like something that is not just circulating across domains, so from offline it becomes online, but it's also it's going back and forth, and like it's becoming rematerialized. I think there's like we are into this like centrality of design that is not just design to create something that is very, very tangible, but also design that reminds us of something tangible but is really not. Like design that creates like science fictional like words, but it's still design, right? So I'm very fascinated by that, and I think that by doing this, by tapping into this fascination for design, and tapping also into the fear and the incredible fascination for insects, yes, this industry is doing the same thing that the industrial agriculture has been doing for like a long time, but it is doing it in a very clever way, and it is by marketing itself as like a fringe, and by marketing itself as something that potentially can save the world. So it's the rhetoric behind it that changes, and that makes it kind of interesting to me.
Can I ask you really quick? Is the language of design deployed by those startups, or is that you, like I'm looking at how they design, but are they actually talking like we apply design thinking, or like how are they deploying design, I guess?
No, they're not talking about design.
Office of Naval Research, while he had Lebbeus Woods in his classroom as an architecture student at University of Illinois. And so you can begin to ask questions about how Lebbeus Woods is going about the question of seeing without seeing through drawing, I think, in some very interesting ways that get to the stakes. And the stakes are what happens to bodies and what happens to everybody's bodies in these kinds of approaches. I mean, that's kind of what I would stitch here.
Yeah, yeah, and then go on very quickly.
Hi, thank
You know,
you.
So, I just want to quickly respond.
Go ahead.
Sorry. I think these hidden histories are fascinating in the way that cybernetics was forced underground by the discourse of digital computing and artificial intelligence. One of those other interesting stories is that some of you might know about the CyberSyn project, where Stafford Beer went to work for Allende's Chile to build a cybernetic socialist democracy, a cybernetic socialist state, and Allende's Minister for Information was Fernando Flores, who went on to co-author probably the first significant volume in human-computer interaction with Winograd, the famous Winograd and Flores volume. What's it called? Human-computer interaction. I can't remember the name, but in any case, and in fact, when artificial life kind of begins to bubble up as a response to the collapse of artificial intelligence, there's this kind of resurfacing of cybernetic ideas again, but it's taboo, and even Rodney Brooks in his writings pretends not to know about cybernetics, even though he later on admits that the thing that really got him into robotics was seeing Grey Walter's turtles. So there's a really fascinating set of historical stories to tell there. Yeah, that's great.
Okay, so thank you for your papers, and it's actually made me think of a seemingly obvious contradiction between interspeciesism and universal design. And so perhaps it's a question more for Roberta, because I was on the metro coming here today, and there is an ad for the insectarium, in case it's a tourist destination here in Montreal, and it says, it reads something to the effect like, ici les petites bébêtes ne mangent pas les gros bébêtes. Like, so here you won't see the big insects eat the small insects. And I just found it fascinating with regard to the fact that, Kevin, you were saying how you don't want to see the consumption of bugs, but you do want to see a really nice design about it. But maybe, Roberta, have you come across some of those, I guess, those contradictions? And also, in terms of universal design, there's a lot of water and there's a lot of plants, but what happened to the marine life in these flooded cities? Thank you.
The oysters are done. I mean, there's a $60 million, actually, that the oyster structure, which is run by Scape, is a $60 million, now is actually being done around Staten Island by Rockefeller Foundation. And I mean, it's gonna kill off all the oysters because, I mean, they're dying to do that. Like, it's dirty water, and basically, so the interesting thing, I think, in terms of the universal design and the interspecies, or the interesting political problem for me, is the way that discourses of universal design are consuming species differentiation in particular ways. That they're both recognizing, it's like destroying difference in its own name, you know, and doing it quite effectively. So it's in the name of the same thing, like these insect companies, that you're preserving the habitat of and the oysters, and at the same time you're kind of creating very particular solutions that are almost determining the oyster's death in some way. I don't know if that was your question.
I was also thinking, also in relation to like seeing without seeing. It's like what I found more in terms of insects is seeing without touching. It's the touching that causes some kind of like rejection, some kind of repulsion. But then when you're eating it, you're still touching it with your tongue, but it's not necessarily perceived in the same way. And I think I found something also, because one of the early things I was very interested in was the insectarium, because I went to, like, a friend of mine lives nearby, so I passed it, and I'm like, oh my God, like, this is like a place where insects are. And I was really interested in, and then I realized that they also have tasting of the insects, I think once a year or something. And like, I was wondering why it had happened here, and what were the strategies that would force people to actually accept this as food. And I think there's a whole lot of food design involved. So you package something beautifully, just so you see it and it's beautiful, and it's got a certain aesthetics that appeals to you, which makes somehow the touching or the being in contact with it more closely like acceptable in some way. But I still have to understand how this really happened.
Just one more thing I'd add to Alice's question is just that I think one of the questions that we want to raise are what are the epistemologies of these universal design approaches. And so sometimes the critiques are only framed, the solutionist critique, which I share, sometimes doesn't get deeply enough into the bases of why sense makes sense to the very renderings of those things in these amazing visualizations and the role of computation even in that. So thanks for your question.
I have a question regarding the aesthetics of the design. I'm not necessarily opposed to the aesthetics if the content is actually matching. You mentioned the word greenwashing. So if there is this design that sells itself as green design, are there any facts supporting that? I mean, what is the CO2 footprint of the packaging? What's the CO2 footprint of fabricating that machine, of maintaining that machine, of the electricity it uses? So is there even any net gain in terms of CO2 usage? Could the company substantiate that? Or is it really just trying to prettify what we may have to eat when we run out of other options? Basically, the question is, what are the scientific facts behind the design?
Oh, yeah. Scientific facts, okay. We are talking about something that is embedded in an ecosystem that is embedded in another ecosystem, that like everything, this is a very complex issue. I mean, if I'm only evaluating the product for its, like, as isolated from anything else, like, I fail. Like, you have to evaluate it, of course, in relation to many other issues that are, many other aspects that are surrounding this product. So we cannot just talk about the insect industry without talking about, we cannot talk about the design of this insect product without talking about the product itself, without talking about the relationship between the product and its customers, and without also talking about the attitude of the customers towards this product, which is what makes it somehow palatable to certain people, because clearly it catering to a certain population. I don't think, I mean, we can go on and try to find scientific evidence of the sustainability of this product, but then you won't see how sustainable it is until you actually like probe it against the rest of the population, the context, the society. I mean, if we are living in a consumerist society and the product only sells if it is marketed in a certain way, it is designed in a certain way, and of course it's not, like it tries to be, it can be as sustainable as you want, but then because we require from it a certain design and a certain standards, then of course it's going to sell only in that form. So I don't know if I'm explaining myself correctly, but I think that the problem is the complexity of the issues, not the product in itself and how scientifically sound it is. So.
Thanks. Yeah. Is this on? Yeah. Well, this is going back to Simon's paper, but I think it does follow. And I'm going to just pose the big cheeky question. A great paper. We just had lunch, and I want to ask you about the way out of the dualisms. And you gave us this incredible sort of account of them, genealogy of them. But so to come to the point, it's about whether notions like embodied cognition or affective cognition, are a way out of the big dualism, of the Cartesian dualism that you gave us so fully developed. And I want to express skepticism and say that the whole problem of the notion of embodied cognition is, of course, the second term is primary, so it's a descriptor of the cognition. Maybe if we reversed them, we said minded bodies or cognitivized bodies, or somehow we could get the social in and talk about minded social bodies. We could keep doing this to try to get out of it. But it seems to be a big problem. And one of the guys we were talking about over lunch, which is this archaeologist Lambros Malafouris, who's very interesting, who's dealing with this kind of issue in his work. What's so striking, isn't it, is that he goes to practice, to the kind of contingencies of the impracticed engagement with things and with environment. So he completely bypasses mind in a way. And that sensory and practical engagement is what then becomes the foundation for the growth of thought and so on and so forth. But so I'm just saying, how do we get out of this, really?
Thanks, Georgie. That's certainly not a brief question, but I will try to answer it somewhat briefly. I agree completely. I think the fundamental question is that we've been encouraged to believe that we have minds, and I reject that entirely. And I mean that very sincerely. I think that we are so naturalized to the notion that there is something called mind, which is the self, and there's something called body, which is something that the self owns, is the problem that we have to get out of in order to make any kind of headway. And certainly when I use the terms embodied cognition and situated cognition and inactive cognition, I'm not subscribing to cognitivism. I'm not subscribing to the idea that intelligence is something that occurs inside the black box by manipulation of symbols. I pretty much reject all of that. I think that intelligence, and this is where the conflict between digitalism and art practice really hits the road, is as an artist, as a practitioner, one experiences one's intelligence as a successful operation in the world. The successful manipulation of materials and artifacts via prosthetics and tools. We don't live the model of input processing output that we've been sold, and digital culture constantly reinforces back onto the whole of society because of the perniciousness of this paradigm. We're constantly encouraged to believe that there is mind and there is body, that there's information and there's matter. It's all bogus. It's all wrong, but it's a fundamentally Enlightenment notion that our language, at least English, is completely wrapped around. I mean, I say my foot. Well, who's the me that owns the foot? And why can't I say I foot? Well, it sounds ridiculous, right? We can't speak. I mean, it takes a huge intellectual effort to speak outside of the naturalization to the mind-body dualism.
Okay. On that note, I think we are going to have to wind up. So it's kind of milk and cookies time for people who have bodies as well as minds. And I would like to thank our wonderful panelists and our extremely attentive audience. Thank you very much.